Tom Coleman, former Republican member of Congress from the state of Missouri. Well, we have to look at the Constitution, and the framers wrote a Constitution because they had an unaccountable king that they were having to deal with. And so after the Revolutionary War, when the Constitution was written, they wanted to make sure that nobody, neither the president, the Congress, or the courts, had all the powers in their hands. In other words, they divided it up into three branches: the legislative with the Congress, the executive headed by the president and his administration, and then the courts, of course, the highest court being the Supreme Court. You add on top of that a federalism role for the states. The powers that were not given explicitly to the Congress in the Constitution were reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. So we have a lot of checks and balances here. All the branches have to work together. And in fact, the states and the federal government have to work together and should work together. And they have a check on each other. The biggest check, and the check that I certainly found as a member of Congress, is the oversight function of Congress. And that simply means that they have to check the president and the courts to see that they are enforcing the law, that they aren't corrupting, there's no corruption, there's no bad management. If there is, to ferret it out and to deal with it. So Congress really is, you look at it, the most powerful branch if they exercise their absolutely constitutional authority. Now, the president has said, and his lawyers have said, that he has absolute immunity from these checks. And that is preposterous. It's wrong, and it's not constitutional. In fact, the lawyers of the president have said that he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and wouldn't be answerable to anybody. Neither the local law enforcement, the local prosecutor, the federal government, the federal courts, and of course, if you want to talk about impeachment, we can go through that too, because they raised the same issues in impeachment that they did in the courts. I believe that the president and his lawyers believe in a crackpot theory of constitutional law that says it's the unitary theory of executive power, which means there can be no limits on the president by Congress, by the courts, by law enforcement. This is, as I call it, a crackpot idea, but it's been embraced by the lawyers for the president in all of his litigation and also in impeachment. He also plays a shell game that if he's in front of the courts, it's got to be the Congress and impeachment that can only hold him accountable. When he's in impeachment process in the Congress, it's the courts or it's something else. It's always something else. And it's kind of like the chaos theory. He keeps moving the thing around. It's the old shell game. So you got to overcome that. But the real theory that the president and his lawyers are using is he has no limits on his power. This is I don't think the public would ever think they would hear from a member of the presidency saying that he can do anything that he wants. And that's the quote that he made not too recently away. So Richard Nixon actually said something like this: if the president does it, it must be legal. And Richard Nixon was not the highest quality of person to occupy the White House before Donald Trump. This whole theory on the president's position that he cannot be held accountable is wrong. And it's actually the musings of a dictator of a banana republic. And that's certainly not anything we want in this country. If law enforcement in the states and the federal government, if the Congress and the courts cannot hold a president accountable, he is not accountable. And the only way that you could be accountable is to the voters at an election. And of course, we have an election coming up now that I believe that Donald Trump will be held accountable. We also have a pandemic, which makes voting even a bigger challenge than usual. So there are many obstacles here. Nothing's for sure except the president's term will end promptly at 12 noon on January 20th, 2021. Well, there's a bedrock principle in our Constitution, and that is that no one is above the law, including the President of the United States. No matter what your station in life is, how wealthy you are, how high an office you might hold, you are not above the law. And I think that we get pretty well tied up with the personalities here. But this moment in time is more than just about Donald Trump. It is, in fact, a moment when we need to recognize that as citizens of the United States, we need to safeguard our democracy. Democracy was written into the Constitution so that those people who wrote the Constitution and we would be able to live in a democracy. And really, the moment in time here is to assure that our children and our grandchildren can live in a nation with freedom. Republicans used to be the party of the rule of law. It appears now that that may have been called into question. James Madison, who is known as the father of our Constitution, was very much aware of how people in power might be able and want to bring all the power into their hands. In other words, another dictatorial king. And that's why they wrote the Constitution as it did. In fact, Madison, in assuring that the Constitution was going to be adopted, wrote part of the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, he said, basically, that anybody who were to get all of these powers, the legislative power of the Congress, the executive power of the presidency, and not have a court to be responsible to, all that those powers would make him tyrannical, a king, a dictatorial king. And that's something that he did not want to happen. And so, as we go through this, we know that Donald Trump's arguments can very inconsistent with the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Well, I'm not even sure that if the court were to decide in the president's favor in all of these ideas of the so-called unitary theory of the executive, that we would have nothing left but an executive branch. If you're immune from everything, including the courts, there's nothing to hold you back. I don't think we're going to get to that position, but if we were, the only thing that you could do is to have a vote 4 years later. That would be too late. We would, in fact, end our democracy at that point. Now, what happens and how can a president be held accountable and should be held accountable is by the court deciding that the president's arguments were fallacious and wrong and unconstitutional, and that therefore they will issue a decision, and if necessary, an order that the president do certain things. If that means to testify before the Congress or to submit documents or allow his officials in his administration to appear before Congress and the courts, then that will be the order. I hope that this president would follow such an order. Well, when I was in Congress, it was amazing how the arguments many times centered around the personality of the president. When Ronald Reagan was president and George Bush was president while I was in Congress, many times the laws would be passed to basically hold them back because of certain things or the other party's dislike of that particular president. And I always said, well, what happens if the presidency changes and instead of Reagan or Bush being there, it would be somebody else, a much more, perhaps even more conservative thing. Then you can reverse this. What if, Teddy Kennedy became president and you've written this as Republicans to give him much more power? You wouldn't like that. You cannot legislate that way, and the court should not decide that way. What you have to do is take the personalities out of it and think about what happens without the rule of law. That is fundamental. The rule of law is written throughout our Constitution, throughout every statute. We have lived by the rule of law for over 250 years. To destroy that concept, even allowing one person above the law would be destructive. We cannot afford that. Our children and grandchildren and their future is now being called into question if we do not have the rule of law. The rule of law means that regardless of your status in society, regardless of the amount of money you may have or the amount of lawyers that you can, in fact, retain, no one's above the law. Everybody is equal. It's equality before the law. And that's how our justice system is set up. That's how we conduct ourselves. We do not have a royalty in this country. We do not have a king. The king is unanswerable to the public. Here we have a president who is and should be answerable not only to the public, but to the elected Congress and to the courts and the judiciary. There is a responsibility to the states. It's all a give and go. It's all a shared governing process, and it's a check on each other. So the federal government can check on the states, and the states can certainly have all their powers that they need to do certain things, mostly through health and safety. And the biggest power in the federal government can be through, in many cases, interstate commerce to regulate. So it's a joint effort, and we shouldn't be pitting the federal government versus the states or the states versus the states, some states versus the states. That's a luxury we can ill afford, certainly under current circumstances.